Good morning, children. I'm quite sure you must be finding this poem quite interesting, and probably it must have touched your heart. The beautiful things that are around us have very mesmerizing effect, and if you think about the beauties that are there in the surrounding, in the natural surrounding, you yourselves will forget the sadness, frustration, and all those factors which will make you gloomy and melancholic. This poem, A Thing of Beauty, is written by the famous romantic poet John Keats. The poem tells about how nature and its wonder mesmerize us and take away all the sorrows that surround us from time to time. Endymion is an epic poem in English, and this poem is based on the Greek mythology of Endymion, who was a shepherd who loved the moon goddess Selene. Now, in the first stanza, we have seen that a thing of beauty is a joy forever. What it means? It means a thing of beauty is a constant source of joy. Its beauty never fades. It keeps on increasing with passage of time. It provides us peace, a sleep full of sweet dreams, and we will definitely have good health if we think about the beautiful things around us. Now let us go to the second stanza of this poem, A Thing of Beauty. Therefore, on every morrow, are we wreathing a flowery band to bind us to the earth? What do these lines mean? On every morrow. Morrow means tomorrow, the following day, the next day. On every next day, when you're thinking of it, or on every day or next day, what are we doing? Are we reading? Are we weaving a wreath? And this wreath of what? Flowers. A flowery band, a garland, a wreath. Are we weaving a wreath? Are we attaching ourselves to bind us to the earth? We see the beautiful landscape and we find a kind of bond. And as if we are weaving a flowery band, a garland, a wreath. And when we think about those beautiful things in nature, we find a kind of attachment to our Mother Earth. We start getting closer to the earth. We start getting closer to the nature. We ourselves get immersed into the nature. Now let us think about these two lines from the point of view of the poetic devices. Now one poetic device which very easily you can find out is alliteration. And what is alliteration? Alliteration is repetition of consonant sounds. And here is an example of alliteration. That is band to bind. B sound is repeated there. So this is an example of alliteration. band to bind, a flowery band to bind. So band, bind, b sound is repeated there. So that is an example of alliteration. Then let us see how metaphorically the poet says, are we reading a flowery band? Reading a flowery band to bind us to the earth. So a band which can bind us to the earth, a flowery band. So the poet is using very metaphorically here the beautiful things of our life bind us to the earth. So this is an example of metaphor. Are we reading a flowery band? Now, are we reading? There is an inversion. An inversion is also a poetic device. But you can remember alliteration, then try to remember metaphor, a flowery band to bind us to the earth. And one more which you can remember is imagery, a beautiful images, a beautiful visuals have been created in our mind by these two lines. Are we reading a flowery band? See the beautiful image that comes, the picture that comes. So this is also an example of imagery. Imagery means the poet tries to create visual images in our minds. So are we reading a flowery band to bind us to the earth? So this is an example of imagery. Imagery, then metaphor, an example of alliteration, band, bind. So you can remember these poetic devices which are used in these two lines. So what does the poet say here? The poet says that every day, every following day, it's not only every day, every following day too. Or in future, what we are doing, we are always reading a flowery band. We are always weaving a flowery band. We are trying to bind ourselves to the earth. We see beautiful things, and those beautiful things elevate our spirits, and those beautiful things make the life worth living. And that is the reason why we lead the life. We think of leading the life further. Otherwise, because of these frustrations, because of the despair, we don't feel like this life worth living. But its beauties all around us, that is what is creating a kind of attachment to this Mother Earth, and we forget about all that. And what do we find on this earth? This materialistic world. And remember, those were the times, romantic period, those were the times, early 19th century, when industrial revolution had taken place there in Britain. And lot of frustration. People had become materialistic. They started feeling that God really doesn't exist. So there was a kind of despair. And during that particular time, these romantic poets made appeal to the general public to look beautiful things in nature. Nature is godly. Nature has God's powers. So spite of despondence, of the inhuman dearth of noble natures. Now a spite. What does spite mean? Malice, ill will. So some sort of ill intention to harm somebody. And as a result of that, because of jealousy, because of malice, there's a disappointment, despondence. There's a disappointment, dejection. People feel depressed, disappointed. And it's mainly because of the inhuman dearth of noble natures. You don't find noble nature dearth lacking. People are not moral, ethical. You don't find good people here on this earth. And as a result of that, gloomy days, melancholic days, sad days, we all feel very sad. And these days are very gloomy, melancholic. It's mainly because of dearth of noble nature. Lacking. People are lacking noble nature. People are lacking humanitarian values, moral values, ethical values. There's a lot of jealousy in this world. There's a lot of greed in this world. As a result of that, there's a lot of disappointment, frustration, dejection, and the life has become very melancholic and gloomy. And what do we find here? Of all the unhealthy ways, a lot of corruption is there. Not healthy ways, or darkened ways. People want to harm others. Very dark ways, diabolic intentions. And because of all that made our searching, and that's why we are looking for something else. We are looking for something else. What is that we are looking for? We want to get rid of all this. Our lives have turned melancholic, gloomy. Lot of sadness is there. Now here the poet says, don't worry. In spite of all these unhealthy ways, over-darkened ways, people lacking noble nature, despite all this, some shape of beauty. Look at the beautiful things that are around us. Those beautiful things which are there in different forms, some shape, they are there in different forms. These landscapes which are there in different forms, they will move away the pall, the covering from our dark spirits. Our spirits have become very dark. We are dejected. We are very sad. But don't worry. These beautiful things will take away all that sadness that your spirit has felt. And what are those beautiful things? Those are the things. The sun, the moon, the trees, old and young. The trees which are old and young, sprouting, and they are the ones, they are growing. You see the spirit in them, they are growing, and they are providing us shade, and we are blessed with their shade. When it's quite hot, go under those trees, see beautiful those trees, the breeze that under the tree that we get. It's a kind of blessing. It's a boon of the God. It's a boon of the God. And therefore, don't worry about the dejection, disappointment that is there, the bad intentions of people who lack noble nature. Don't worry about them. These are all days, very melancholic, gloomy days. Don't worry about unhealthy ways, over-darkened ways. Because there are so many beautiful things created by God. Go and immerse yourselves with those beauties. It will take away all that sadness. It will remove the sadness which is there in your heart. It's a blessing. But you have to seek that. You have to go in the lap of the nature. Forget about all that. Now let us take up this stanza to study the poetic devices. The figures of speech. First of all, we'll take up an example of a metaphor. And here the example of a metaphor is wreathing a flowery band. The beautiful things of our life are binding us to the earth. And what is happening there? We are weaving a flowery band. So it is used metaphorically. We are looking at the beautiful things that are in front of us, which are lined up in a string, in a band. So one after other, the beautiful things. And as you go on watching them, as you go on looking at them, there's a kind of band. So we are weaving those beautiful things in a flowery band. And as a result of that, what happens? We start getting immersed into those beautiful landscape. We forget about ourselves. So here the poet has used very metaphorically. Here the poet has compared those beautiful things to a flowery band which we wreath. So wreath, that's a noun form, and wreathing is verb form. So it's a wreathing. Wreathing means what? It's a weaving into a wreath, weaving into a flowery band. And as a result of that, we are binding us to the earth. We are getting attached to the earth. So the poet has used very metaphorically. And if they ask you in the exam, you're right, wreathing a flowery band. That is what is the example of metaphor. Now let us go to the another poetic device, that is alliteration. Very easily you will be able to find out the examples of alliteration. Now remember, when you talk about alliteration, you have to find out the use of consonant sounds at the beginning of two words. And which are close in series. So it should be in the same line. Like here you take the example of band to bind. Verb sound is repeated there. So that is an example of alliteration. Do you find any other example there? Yes. You'll find it in the fourth line. And what is it? Noble nature. None sound is repeated there. So that is also an example of alliteration. One more is there. Try to find out. And that you'll be able to find out there in the second last line. And what is it? Sir sound is repeated there. So that is also an example of alliteration. Some shape, sir sound is repeated there. So that is an example of alliteration. So band to bind, so band bind, noble nature, some shape. So these are the examples of alliterations. Now imagery. Now here you take the example of, are we wreathing a flowery band? Wreathing a flowery band to bind us to the earth. When you read these lines, the visual effect that is there on us, the visual image that is created in our mind, are we wreathing a garland, a flowery band? Whatever, a series of beautiful things are there. And flowers, when we are reading, when we take up one beautiful flower, again another beautiful flower, the poet is looking at the things. One beautiful thing, followed by another beautiful thing, series of beautiful things. And as he goes on looking at those series of beautiful things, he is binding himself to the earth. He suddenly finds himself kind of attachment to the earth. He gets immersed into the beauties of this earth. So here the poet is talking about all that. I hope you understood now. Yes, so that is the example of imagery. Then there's an inversion. That's a normal order of the words that is reversed there. Are we reading? In the question form, what normal order is reversed there. So there's an example of inversion. Are we reading? So we call this one also as a poetic device, inversion. Now here, let's go through the notes here. Man and nature are inseparable. So they find suddenly getting attached to each other. It is the beauty of nature that keeps us attached to this earth. Every morning we collect fresh lovely flowers and prepare garlands. They refresh our moods and we forget our worries for a while. You can always interpret in your own way. Every person gets a bitter taste of sorrow, suffering and grief. Disease, disappointments and misfortune give us mental and physical suffering. It is a beautiful things that remove the pale covering of sadness from our lives and make us happy and hopeful. Thank you. Goodbye.